A. 3.1 Spanish Exploration and Colonial Society. If you imagine Spanish exploration as a handful of treasure seekers passing through and disappearing, you miss Spain's core project in North America by the late 1500s and 1600s, building a durable network. Spain aimed to create strategic footholds that could defend ocean routes, project authority inland, and restructure daily life for everyone drawn into Spanish power. Two places make that clear: St. Augustine, Florida, and Santa Fe, New Mexico. They sat on opposite ends of the continent in radically different environments, yet both reveal colonization as a social system rather than a string of expeditions. Each functioned as a military outpost, a mission center, and an administrative hub at the same time, and that combination produced permanent, organized, and often coercive colonial societies in their dealings with nearby native peoples. OpenStax, 3.1 Spanish Exploration and Colonial Society. St. Augustine, Florida. St. Augustine began with a practical fear. Spain's Atlantic lifelines were exposed. By the mid-1500s, ships moved immense wealth and supplies among the Caribbean, Mexico, and Spain, and Florida's coastal waters formed a vulnerable corridor that rivals could disrupt. Founded in 1565, St. Augustine was not driven mainly by hopes of Florida gold or rich farmland. It was a defensive chess square, a permanent base to watch sea lanes, shelter ships, and block European competitors. That included the nearby French at Fort Caroline, which Spain attacked and destroyed the same year. The urgency reflects imperial strategy. Holding territory could matter as much as extracting resources. That purpose shaped how the settlement looked and how it operated. Spain built a fortified town meant to last, not a temporary camp, and its defenses expanded over time, most famously in the Castillo de San Marcos, a massive stone fortification that still stands as evidence Spain expected conflict. From this fortified core, Spain extended influence through a surrounding ring of mission communities. This distinction matters because it separates exploration from colonization. St. Augustine anchored Spanish claims, and defense became routine: drills, maintenance, supply organization. Because the town existed to deter rivals and protect shipping. A permanent town also required institutions, and Spanish Florida developed a clear hierarchy. Governors represented royal authority and managed defense, diplomacy, and trade. Soldiers enforced policy and guarded the settlement, especially during spikes in tension or when rivals appeared. Priests, often Franciscans, were not simply private spiritual counselors. They served a spiritual conquest intended to bring native peoples into Catholic life, and that religious project also supported political goals. Spanish officials believed reorganizing communities around mission churches could make them more predictable and governable, settled in fixed places, tied to Spanish calendars of ritual and work, and integrated into colonial authority. It helps to correct a common misconception here. Missions were not only churches. They provided religious instruction, but they also functioned as economic and political institutions. Drawing people into centralized settlements reshaped where they lived, how they farmed and hunted, how leadership worked, and how labor was organized. In practice, missions often required labor: building, farming, producing goods, and supporting the Spanish presence. So even when framed in spiritual language, the mission system reorganized native settlement patterns and created new labor obligations. These arrangements produced relationships with native peoples that were complex and rarely equal. Spanish officials pursued alliances when useful, but alliances were often reinforced by pressure through military intimidation, sometimes hostage-taking, and the constant reminder of Spanish fortifications and weapons. Conflict persisted because native communities had their own rivalries and strategies, and because Spanish settlement introduced new tensions over land, food, and autonomy. Missions became centers of cultural change, where converts were expected to adopt Catholic practices and often Spanish norms. Alongside cultural pressure came biological catastrophe. Concentrating people in mission communities could accelerate the spread of Old World diseases, such as smallpox and measles, to which native populations had limited immunity. The familiar church in the wilderness image can mislead. When you see missions as reorganized communities shaped by forced labor, cultural suppression, and epidemic vulnerability, they become recognizable as instruments of control. St. Augustine therefore shows Spanish colonization as a layered system. A fort and soldiers projecting military power, governors and administrators asserting royal authority, and priests and missions extending influence into surrounding native communities. It also explains why Spain held Florida despite limited economic payoff compared with Mexico or Peru. St. Augustine's value was strategic, and strategy can outweigh profit when an empire must secure the routes connecting its richest colonies. Santa Fe, New Mexico. If St. Augustine guarded the Atlantic doorway, Santa Fe tested how far Spain could push inland. Founded in 1610 as New Mexico's capital, Santa Fe occupied a different world: high desert, vast distances, and supply lines running back toward Mexico rather than across the sea. That distance is easy to underestimate. A coastal post like St. Augustine could be resupplied by ship even under threat. But Santa Fe lay far from Mexico City and major centers of Spanish power. It had to operate with fewer resources, greater isolation, and heavier reliance on local production and trade. Open stacks, 3.1 Spanish exploration and colonial society. To control this region, Spain relied on a mission frontier system whose parts reinforced one another. Missions aimed to convert and reorganize indigenous communities, while presidios, military posts, provided armed backing and deterred resistance or rivals. Settlements of Spanish colonists linked the area to empire through farming, ranching, and governance. Each part depended on the others. Missions without soldiers could be ignored or attacked. Presidios without food and labor could not survive. Settlements without some indigenous incorporation through trade, coercion, or alliance struggled to endure. Santa Fe was not merely a town. It anchored a regional system intended to turn contested territory into something Spain could claim and administer. This system brought Spaniards into continuous contact with Pueblo peoples, whose communities were settled, agricultural, and deeply rooted. Spanish conversion efforts went beyond encouraging mass attendance. They often suppressed native religious practices and demanded outward Catholic conformity. Authorities also demanded tribute and labor to sustain missions, build structures, produce food, and meet colonial needs. Over time, these pressures generated lasting tension because they targeted Pueblo autonomy, spiritual life, community governance, and control of labor. At the same time, Pueblo peoples were not passive. Some adapted selectively, trading, learning useful Spanish practices, or using Spanish presence to navigate rivalries. Others resisted through noncompliance or open rebellion. Colonial society in New Mexico became a constant negotiation under claimed Spanish dominance that was not always smoothly enforceable. Geography sharpened those negotiations. In an arid environment, farming depended on water management and local knowledge, so Spaniards could not simply impose familiar European agricultural rhythms. Survival required learning crops, seasons, and landscape practices from people who already understood them. Distance from Mexico City also increased dependence on regional trade networks. When supplies take months, local exchange becomes a lifeline, and indigenous knowledge, routes, resources, and trading relationships becomes power. This contrasts with Florida. St. Augustine faced outward toward the ocean, guarding shipping lanes and anticipating foreign fleets, while Santa Fe faced inward toward land networks, holding together a fragile inland project far from the imperial core. Both were Spanish, but their colonial societies developed under different pressures and in different daily realities. When you connect religious suppression, labor demands, disease, and competition for scarce resources, a clear cause and effect pattern emerges in the Southwest through 1700. Spanish policies repeatedly generated conflict. Tribute demands intensified hardship in a resource-limited region, and punishing native religious practices turned spirituality into a battleground. Epidemics weakened communities and amplified strain. Over time, this combination made large-scale resistance possible, even likely, because resentment came from an entire system attempting to reorder Pueblo life. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680, driving Spaniards out of New Mexico for more than a decade, shows the pattern most clearly. It was coordinated resistance rooted in decades of tension rather than a single spark. When Spain returned, it returned to a region that had proven it could push back, and that reality shaped colonial society into the 18th century. Taken together, St. Augustine and Santa Fe show Spanish colonization as something built and maintained, walls and forts, but also routines, hierarchies, labor expectations, and claims of spiritual authority. They also show colonial societies were never purely European creations. Native peoples were not peripheral obstacles. They were central participants, sometimes coerced, sometimes allied, sometimes resisting, whose choices and endurance shaped what Spanish North America became. Seeing that helps explain why other European empires did not simply copy a single Spanish model. They watched what Spain built, where it held, where it provoked resistance, and how geography changed outcomes, because North America was already becoming a contested patchwork of competing colonial social orders. B. 3.2. Colonial rivalries. When we picture colonies, it's easy to default to the English model: towns of farming families, fast population growth, and steady expansion for land. But European rivalry in North America didn't always look like that. Some empires came less to settle and more to move goods, ships, information, and profit. The Dutch and French illustrate this especially well. Neither could ignore that native nations already controlled the interior, key rivers, and the trade routes that mattered most, so both relied heavily on alliances and partnerships. The difference was emphasis. The Dutch treated North America mainly as a business venture built around ports and markets, while the French maintained a thinner settler presence that stretched inland along waterways and blended commerce with Catholic missions. Those choices shaped their economies, their relationships with native communities, and their vulnerability when European rivalries intensified. Fur trading in New Netherland. The Dutch Republic rose in the 1600s as a maritime commercial powerhouse, and New Netherland reflected that identity. The Dutch were not trying to plant a huge farming population the way the English increasingly did, and they weren't building a Spanish-style conquest empire centered on mines and forced labor. Their core aim was profit, which meant creating a commercial hub that could extract North American resources for Atlantic markets and control waterways that made trade efficient and defensible, deep harbor, major river access, and a location that linked inland commerce to ocean shipping. That logic made the fur trade, especially beaver pelts, the engine of New Netherland. In Europe, beaver felt was prized for fashionable hats, turning beavers into a kind of cash crop even without fields. Wealth came less from acres cultivated and more from a network: hunters and trappers in the interior, native suppliers who controlled access to fur regions, and Dutch merchants who transported, financed, and sold the product. If Virginia tobacco suggests plantations and barrels, New Netherland's fields were forests and wetlands, and its rows were river routes and seasonal trading patterns. It was a different economy, but with the same basic linkage: land and labor feeding European consumption. New Amsterdam on Manhattan became the hub, an Atlantic-facing port built to gather and redistribute wealth, with furs coming in and European goods going out. But a trade-centered colony is only as strong as its trade flow, which makes it unusually dependent on diplomacy and vulnerable to competition. If native partners control supply, the Dutch cannot simply command production the way plantation owners might. They must negotiate, maintain relationships, and pay attention to what rival Europeans are offering because partners can shift. That's where power dynamics become visible. Native suppliers were not passive helpers. Many native communities understood European competition and used it. If Dutch goods or terms became less favorable, leaders could compare them to French or English alternatives. Even nearby native nations could choose differently depending on their rivalries, security needs, and economic goals. European rivalry didn't just pit flags against flags, it fed into intertribal politics. A native nation might trade with the Dutch to strengthen itself against an enemy, gain firearms or metal tools, or secure an alliance that deterred attacks. Because Dutch prosperity depended on these partnerships, Dutch influence in the interior had limits. This transaction-based system also made New Netherland strategically fragile. By 1664, the Dutch settler population remained relatively small, far smaller than the rapidly growing English colonies, so when rivalry sharpened, the Dutch position was exposed. The English captured New Amsterdam and renamed it New York. This was more than a name change. It shows how empires treated colonies as strategic assets. A port controlling waterways and trade routes is valuable even without a large settler base, which makes it a prime target. England gained not only territory but a ready-made commercial hub that fit neatly into an expanding English Atlantic system. One more Dutch connection is easy to miss if we focus only on New Netherland. Dutch maritime commerce was woven into the broader Atlantic economy, including the expanding system of African slavery. A striking example appears in the familiar 1619 marker. Dutch traders sold the first Africans in Jamestown. Jamestown was English, but the transaction reflects Dutch strength on Atlantic sea routes, moving goods, people, and capital across imperial boundaries. Even with a modest North American footprint, Dutch commercial power intersected with, and helped fuel, an Atlantic world where coerced labor and racial slavery were growing. Colonial rivalry, then, wasn't only about forts and flags. It was also about controlling the flow of labor and commodities across oceans. Commerce and conversion. In New France, the French model also depended on trade and alliances, but it had a different feel. Quebec, founded in 1608 as the first permanent French settlement in North America, signals French priorities. Positioned on the St. Lawrence River, essentially a highway into the continent, Quebec suggests river access and interior routes more than an ocean-facing port city. The French were less focused on quickly building dense European farming settlements and more focused on plugging into a geography that already connected native nations through trade, travel, and diplomacy. The fur trade again sat at the center, but New France pursued it through dispersed inland networks rather than concentrating commerce in one dominant port. French routes stretched from the St. Lawrence into the Great Lakes and beyond. And this is where voyageurs matter. They were traders traveling by canoe, carrying goods over portages, and moving through indigenous-controlled territories to exchange European items for furs. The colony's success depended less on importing thousands of farming families than on maintaining mobile networks and the relationships that made movement and exchange possible. French influence spread like a web rather than filling space like a solid block. New France also added something the Dutch generally did not: organized missionary activity, especially by Jesuits and other Catholic orders. French expansion often blended commerce with conversion. Profit still mattered, but religion was part of the official imperial vision. Jesuits established missions aimed at converting native peoples to Catholicism, and those missions became sites of diplomacy and cultural contact. Conversion could be sincere as a spiritual project, yet it also helped missionaries learn languages, build relationships, and embed French influence in communities that mattered to trade. Native responses varied widely. Some converted, some blended Christian and indigenous practices in ways missionaries disliked, and many resisted conversion entirely. Either way, missions gave French colonialism a more explicit cultural and religious agenda than the Dutch model. As with the Dutch, the key point is that native nations were strategic actors. French survival depended on alliances, and those alliances formed within complex intertribal politics, control of routes, existing wars, and decisions about which outside partnership best served local interests. When the French allied with certain groups, they stepped into pre-existing conflicts and balances of power. Alliances could open trade corridors and bring military support, but they could also pull the French into conflict zones they did not fully control. As European competition intensified, first among France, the Dutch, and later England, access to European trade goods could shift power between native nations. If one group gained reliable access to weapons or metal tools through one European partner, others had strong incentives to seek their own alliances or disrupt those routes. Because of this, New France developed deep inland relationships that were both strength and vulnerability. French influence could extend far beyond the small settler base along the St. Lawrence because forts, trading posts, missionaries, and mobile traders could connect France to a huge interior so long as alliances held. But that influence depended on continued cooperation and trust. The French could not simply replace native political authority through large-scale settlement. Their North American empire was, in a real sense, co-created through partnership, negotiation, and sometimes conflict with native nations. Side by side, the contrast becomes clear without turning them into absolute opposites. The Dutch approach was commercial and port-oriented, organized around a major hub like New Amsterdam, and a profit-driven view of North America as a node in global trade. The French also pursued commerce but combined it with conversion and built inland reach through rivers and relationships, with voyageurs and missionaries operating far from major French cities. In both cases, the fur trade shaped politics. It forced Europeans to rely on native suppliers and diplomats, and it gave native nations leverage because the key commodity could not be produced without indigenous participation and consent. This helps explain a pattern that will keep returning. European empires weren't only competing for land in the abstract, they competed for access, rivers, harbors, trade networks, and alliances. With that in view, later wars between Britain and France make more sense. They weren't sudden eruptions so much as the outcome of decades spent building different colonial systems tied to particular geographies and relationships, constantly reshaped by the choices native nations made in a rapidly changing Atlantic world. C. 3.3 English Settlements in America. The Diverging Cultures of the New England and Chesapeake Colonies. If you zoom out to England's mainland colonies on the Atlantic coast in the 1600s, it's tempting to label it all English America. But daily life in Massachusetts Bay and life along Virginia's tidewater rivers developed in noticeably different ways. Family patterns, politics, and neighbor-to-neighbor relationships. No single factor explains it. The differences came from forces working together: climate and geography, disease, profitable work, who migrated and why, and the religious aims settlers brought with them. Motives and settlement patterns set the direction early. New England was closer to what historians call a neo-Europe. Many settlers planned to stay and rebuild a stable social world of households, churches, and towns. That goal encouraged clustered towns where neighbors cleared land near one another, built a meeting house and school, and expanded as new towns split off. The Chesapeake, especially early Virginia, developed more like a plantation frontier. Investors wanted returns, migrants sought land and quick cash, and navigable rivers encouraged scattered farms and plantations along waterways. You can hear the difference in the basic comparison: community replication versus commodity production. Those motives connected directly to demography and health. New England's climate and disease environment generally supported longer life expectancy, and the sex ratio was more balanced. That made stable family formation easier: more family migration, more adults living long enough to raise children, more multi-generational households, and more natural population increase. In the Chesapeake, warmer conditions, marshy environments, and mosquito-borne disease produced far higher death rates, especially early on. With a population skewed toward young men arriving alone, family life was fragile, later marriage, orphan children, and a less settled social fabric. Labor systems followed from those conditions. In New England, smaller farms and common family migration meant households could rely heavily on family labor, sometimes adding an apprentice or hired hand, while also combining farming with fishing, timber, and local trade. In the Chesapeake, tobacco demanded intense labor and rewarded expansion. One household rarely provided enough workers to plant, tend, harvest, and process tobacco at scale, so planters relied first on indentured servants and increasingly on enslaved Africans. Labor wasn't an add-on, it structured daily life and shaped power. Politics grew out of settlement and labor patterns. New England towns were compact, so participation often happened face-to-face. Town meetings weren't quaint traditions. They worked because neighbors lived within walking distance and shared the assumption that the community should regulate behavior for the common good. In the Chesapeake, dispersed plantations made town-style governance difficult. Authority centered on counties, courts, and local elites spread over larger spaces. Both regions claimed English liberties, but one experienced them through constant community negotiation, while the other lived with a thinner institutional network stretched across wide distances. It's tempting to reduce the contrast to New England was religious and the Chesapeake was about money. Religion and profit mattered, but the stronger explanation is how causes reinforced each other. Geography shapes settlement, settlement shapes politics, disease shapes demography, demography shapes family stability shapes labor needs shape race and class structures. That kind of reasoning holds up even when the details get messy. The Chesapeake Colonies, Virginia and Maryland. The Chesapeake begins as a struggle to survive and becomes a system organized for profit. A few dates show politics and labor changing side by side. In Jamestown, 1619 marks two milestones that belong in the same story. The first elected legislature in English America, the House of Burgesses, and the arrival and sale of the first Africans in Jamestown. One did not directly cause the other, but they developed together as the colony expanded self-government while also expanding coerced labor. Tobacco made the region's choices easy to see. European demand turned it into a lucrative cash crop, and cash crops pull land, labor, and capital toward themselves. Tobacco depleted soil quickly, so planters constantly sought fresh land. Chesapeake geography, rivers that could carry hogsheads directly to ships, made it efficient to place plantations along waterways rather than build dense towns. That land hunger drove expansion into native lands and increased conflict as settlements spread. The economy shaped not just what colonists grew, but where they lived and how often they fought. Planters then faced the core colonial question: who would do the labor? The English did attempt to enslave Native Americans, but in the Chesapeake it largely failed as a stable labor solution. Sources repeatedly note that native captives could escape too easily. They knew the terrain, had nearby communities, and could disappear into networks the English could not control. This did not protect native people from violence and coercion, but it did mean native enslavement did not reliably meet plantation labor demand. That pushed colonists toward indentured servitude. Indentured servants traded a fixed term of labor, often around 7 years, though it varied, for passage to America, and the promise of freedom dues, such as tools, clothing, and sometimes a chance at land. Many were driven by push factors in England like poverty, unemployment, limited access to land, and blocked mobility, while the pull factor was the dream of a reset. A young man with no inheritance might trade years of hard labor for the possibility of a future farm. Some achieved that, but it was risky. disease, brutal masters, and the reality that prime land could be claimed by wealthier planters before a servant gained freedom made the path uncertain. Over time, indentured servitude strained. As conditions in England shifted and reports of harsh Chesapeake life spread, the servant supply fluctuated. Meanwhile, elites were building plantations that needed a workforce they could control permanently, not temporarily. This helps explain the growth of African slavery and its hardening into a racial caste system in the late 1600s. Enslaved Africans could not claim freedom after a term of years, and their children could also be forced into slavery, creating a more predictable labor supply for planters and an expanding system of permanent, inheritable, racialized captivity for the enslaved. Chesapeake instability also makes sense in a frontier context marked by rapid expansion, violent conflict at the edges, and many men who served as indentured laborers and then expected opportunities that became harder to secure. Bacon's rebellion in 1676 is the key case because it exposes these tensions. Frontier settlers demanded harsher action against native peoples and resented what they saw as an elite government protecting its own interests. Coastal planters feared disorder, attacks, and a growing class of angry, armed men. The rebellion wasn't only about native policy, and it wasn't only about class, but it shows how those pressures could collide. Afterward, elites drew a lesson about control. A labor force that completes contracts, becomes land-hungry, and can join uprisings looks politically dangerous. A permanently enslaved labor force is morally horrific, but to those in power, it appeared more controllable. That helps explain the tightening of slave codes and a deeper commitment to racial slavery in the late 1600s and early 1700s. The tragic irony is that a search for stability and profit produced a system that imposed daily violence and instability on enslaved people. Puritan New England. While the Chesapeake expanded along rivers with tobacco at its center, New England developed as a different kind of experiment. In 1620, the Pilgrims founded Plymouth, often remembered as the first New England colony. Plymouth stayed relatively small, but it matters as an early model of survival through cohesion, shared agreements, shared labor, and shared religious purpose. Soon after, the larger Puritan migration reshaped the region. Puritans were not mainly lone adventurers chasing a quick crop. Many arrived in family groups intending to build towns, congregations, and a lasting society. Religion shaped organization in ways that reached far beyond private belief. Puritans aimed to build a godly society, and that goal influenced law, education, and community expectations. Town life centered on the church, and moral regulation became a communal project. In Puritan communities, religion tied directly to ideas about order, work, family roles, and belonging. Education mattered partly because reading the Bible mattered, which helped drive higher literacy and more schooling than you might expect in a frontier setting. Shared goals pushed institutions into existence. This community focus shaped social structure. Because family migration was common and life expectancy generally higher than in the Chesapeake, New England grew through natural increase, more children surviving, more stable households, and more generations forming dense networks. Settlement expanded through new towns rather than isolated farms, clusters around a meeting house, then new groups moving outward to found another town with its own congregation, governance, and shared norms. Mutual oversight was built in, and reputation carried real weight. These towns were not built on empty land. Relationships with native peoples could begin with trade, diplomacy, and alliances, and early survival sometimes depended on them. But those ties were fragile because of deep differences in land use, political authority, and cultural expectations. English settlers tended to treat land as exclusive, legally bounded property backed by deeds, while many native communities understood land through shared use, seasonal movement, and different structures of authority. Even when each side pursued what seemed like reasonable self-interest, misunderstanding was built into the situation. As English towns multiplied, land pressure intensified, and cooperation could turn into conflict. That escalation produced a series of Indian wars tied to the structural force of English expansion. The conflict to remember here is King Philip's War, also called Metacom's War, in 1676, the same year as Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia. In New England, the war represented major native resistance to expansion and reshaped regional demographics and attitudes. Towns were attacked, native communities were devastated, and English colonists emerged more fearful and hardened. Even with an English military victory, the war left trauma and helped justify further dispossession. By the late 1600s, the contrast between regions was hard to miss. New England's town networks, family stability, and religious community building on one hand, and the Chesapeake's plantation frontier, cash crop land hunger, and labor systems that increasingly made racial slavery central to wealth on the other. Holding both in view makes it easier to understand what colonization produced, not just settlements, but durable regional cultures. D3.4, the impact of colonization, the institution of slavery. European empires in the Americas weren't pursuing exploration for its own sake. Their goal was profit, and in the 1500s and 1600s, profit depended on labor, clearing land, planting, harvesting, building, cutting timber, and moving goods. The labor problem wasn't secondary. It sat beneath nearly every colonial plan because claiming land on a map meant little unless someone worked it year after year. Many colonizers first tried the most direct solution, forcing native people to work. In some places, especially where conquest was rapid and colonial control concentrated, indigenous people were enslaved. But across much of North America, this approach often failed for practical reasons tied to power, geography, and survival. Native communities knew the terrain, and captivity near forests, rivers, and familiar routes made escape more feasible than it would be for someone carried far from home. At the same time, epidemic disease devastated native populations, destabilizing villages and families. That collapse shrank the available labor pool and pushed communities to focus on survival and cohesion rather than supplying coerced workers. As a long-term broad labor strategy, widespread native enslavement proved unreliable in many regions. English colonies, especially Virginia and Maryland, expanded another system rooted in English law, indentured servitude. A person signed a contract, often about 7 years, trading labor for Atlantic passage and freedom dues at the end. In effect, servants financed migration by repaying the cost with years of work. Indenture was brutal and frequently deadly, but its defining legal feature was that it was time-limited. In theory, an indentured servant remained a person with a future status beyond service. The deeper shift came as colonists increasingly chose a system that was not time-limited. Chattel slavery made a person property for life and made that status inheritable so children could be born enslaved. This change did more than raise profits. It created a rigid social order in which free and enslaved became permanent, family-based categories rather than temporary conditions individuals might move through. Over time in English North America, that permanence hardened into racial hierarchy. Black increasingly meant enslavable, and white increasingly meant entitlement to freedom and legal protection. It developed unevenly. Early records show mixed, shifting practices. But across the 1600s, the trend is clear. Law and custom crystallized into a racial caste system. This transformation also fits the broader Atlantic context. Colonial labor was supplied through an international forced migration system linking Europe, Africa, and the Americas, often summarized as triangular trade. European merchants carried goods to African coasts. Enslaved Africans were transported across the Atlantic in the Middle Passage, and plantation products like sugar and tobacco flowed into Atlantic markets. Slavery was not merely a local labor arrangement. It became an international economic engine, and imperial rivalry accelerated it. If one empire grew wealthy from plantation labor, others felt pressure to compete for markets and output, and that competition helped normalize brutality as business, framed as profit and national power. A key anchor point in English North America remains 1619, when a ship arrived in Virginia and Africans were sold at Jamestown. It's often misread as the instant slavery began everywhere in its later form. More accurately, it marks an early milestone. The English colonial economy was already tying itself to the Atlantic slave trade, and African labor entered as planters sought stability and profit. In the following decades, the balance shifted. Indentured servitude persisted for a time, but the incentives of lifelong inheritable labor, combined with laws increasingly defining slavery as racial, pushed colonial society toward a system that shaped wealth, politics, and daily life. Changes to native life. Once you understand colonization as the creation of new economies and social systems, the scale of native transformation becomes easier to explain. Change came not only through wars and treaties, but also through biological forces and persistent economic pressure, often operating together in ways people at the time didn't fully understand. Disease was the most devastating unintended consequence of European arrival. The severity was not because native communities were inherently weaker, but because they lacked long-term exposure to the Afro-Eurasian disease pool, shaped by centuries of dense populations and domesticated animals. When smallpox, measles, and influenza arrived, epidemics could tear through entire regions. The impact was political as well as human. Leaders died, elders carrying cultural knowledge were lost, villages emptied or merged, and regional power balances shifted. A nation dominant in one decade could become vulnerable in the next, giving rivals openings. In some areas, epidemics traveled trade routes ahead of major settlement, so Europeans sometimes entered landscapes already destabilized. Not because native people gave up, but because they were surviving catastrophe. As colonial populations grew, warfare and displacement intensified. Land seizures were not abstract legal transactions. They meant losing planting grounds, hunting territories, fishing sites, and sacred geographies tied to identity and survival. In New England, King Philip's War, 1676, part of the broader New England Indian Wars, shows how quickly conflict could escalate. It emerged from mounting tension over land, autonomy, and English town expansion. Violence was extreme on all sides, with brutal consequences: widespread death, destroyed communities, and the capture and enslavement of native people, some of whom were sold far from their homelands. For English colonists, the war hardened attitudes and fueled demands for land secured by force. For native nations, it was devastating, but not an ending. It was one of many moments requiring rebuilding, relocation, and adaptation. Not all change came only through violence. Economic and political realignment reshaped native life in complex ways, and the fur trade is a clear example. European demand for beaver pelts increased the value of certain hunting territories, while European goods, metal tools, firearms, cloth became central to trade relationships. Some native nations used these connections strategically. Securing weapons or serving as middlemen could strengthen their position against rivals. The rise of the Iroquois Confederacy as a major Northeast power connects to this world of diplomacy, trade competition, and shifting alliances. But the same system destabilized others, especially communities caught between competing empires or driven into dependence on trade goods that were hard to replace locally. A simple story, European contact ruined everything in one straight line, doesn't hold up. The reality is harsher and more revealing. Native nations made choices under extreme constraints. Alliance building could be strategy rather than surrender, and trading could be adaptation rather than ignorance. Resistance could be a deliberate political decision to defend sovereignty, not a final desperate gesture. Treaties and shifting alliances with French, Dutch, Spanish, or English colonists reflect diplomacy in a rapidly changing world, not a lack of native agency. Cultural and religious pressure added another layer. Spanish and French missions sought conversion and often tried to reorganize community life around European religious and social norms. English expansion often operated differently, less mission-centered in many areas and more focused on replacing native land use with English towns and farms. But it still challenged native governance and family structures. Conversion and cultural pressure could be coercive, sometimes backed by force or tied to access to food and trade. Yet adaptation did not mean disappearance. Many communities blended practices, preserved traditions in altered forms, negotiated the terms of contact, and resisted when necessary. A more accurate picture is not vanishing, but generations of persistence under extraordinary stress, with outcomes shaped by geography, leadership, and which colonial power was present. Environmental changes, labor systems, disease, war, and trade played out on the land, and the land did not remain the same. Altered landscapes means more than a few new farms. Colonization reorganized space and land use in ways that reshaped ecosystems. European settlement promoted private property, fixed boundaries, and permanent agriculture. Forests were cleared for crops and for timber used in ships, houses, fences, and fortifications. Towns and roads opened new movement corridors, and forts projected imperial power into contested areas. Where forests had been managed through seasonal burning and selective harvesting, colonization often produced a patchwork of fields and pastures with steadily expanding edges. These physical changes became political arguments. Once land was cleared and improved, colonists often claimed that improvement justified ownership, which fueled further dispossession. Introduced species intensified disruption. European livestock, cattle, pigs, horses, weren't just new foods, they reshaped ecologies. Free-ranging pigs could destroy crops and disturb forest floors. Cattle grazing and trampling could compact soil, alter fields and waterways, and change plant communities. Horses later transformed transportation and hunting on the Great Plains, but even earlier, large European animals changed daily relationships between people and land. For native communities dependent on specific plants, managed hunting grounds, and timed agricultural cycles, wandering livestock could directly damage food systems, especially when European ideas about fencing and property didn't match indigenous land use, or when animals were allowed to roam. Environmental change could function like conflict even before open fighting began. Cash crops, especially tobacco in the Chesapeake, accelerated these patterns. Tobacco depleted soil nutrients quickly, pushing planters toward either soil maintenance or outward expansion to fresh land. With land perceived as abundant and labor increasingly coerced, expansion often won. That meant constant deforestation and plantation growth toward frontiers where native nations lived and hunted. The chain reaction is straightforward. Tobacco profits reward planting more planting requires more land requires pushing boundaries, and pushed boundaries increase conflict. Labor demand rises with expansion, feeding the growth of slavery, which makes plantation agriculture more scalable and profitable. Environmental transformation and social transformation were parts of the same system. Resource extraction beyond farming mattered as well, and the fur trade again links economy to ecology and native livelihoods. As beaver pelts became a major export, beaver populations declined in heavily trapped regions. That shift matters because beavers are ecosystem engineers. Dams create wetlands, shape river flow, support fish and birds, and influence water storage. Reducing beavers can alter wetlands and waterways, affecting local food availability and stream navigability. A market trend in Europe could become a material environmental change in North America, with direct consequences for communities living there. Rather than treating these as disconnected harms, it makes more sense to see colonization as systemic transformation. Labor demand encouraged land expansion. Expansion intensified conflict. Conflict and disease reshaped political power. Trade tied distant markets to local ecologies, and imperial rivalry rewarded fast wealth and extractive choices. By the late 1600s, colonies were not European outposts on an unchanged continent. They were new social and environmental worlds built through coercion and negotiation, survival and adaptation. Those worlds set the stage for the class divisions, racial hierarchies, and political tensions that become even more visible in the 18th century. Knowledge base, schéma 3. Closing concepts. Why this matters. Colonial societies from 1500 to 1700 created enduring regional cultures and power structures, including representative assemblies, religious community models, and plantation economies. These early choices also institutionalized racial slavery, intensified displacement of native peoples, and permanently reshaped North American environments, patterns that continued to influence U.S. history long after colonization began. When you zoom out from individual events, a governor's decision, a hard winter, a trade boom, a larger pattern comes into focus. From 1500 to 1700, Europeans weren't simply founding settlements. They were experimenting with social organization, who could own land, who counted politically, what labor was valued, how religion shaped daily life, and how communities defined belonging. These decisions didn't fade with the 1600s. They solidified into regional cultures and power structures that shaped later American history. One lasting example is representative government. When Virginia's colonists met in an assembly in 1619, they weren't creating universal democracy. They were solving a governance problem. Settlers risking life and capital wanted a say over taxes and local rules. That linkage, representation tied to property and local control, became a political habit. Later generations expanded it, fought over it, and denied it to many. But the habit normalized participation for some and exclusion for others. Other colonies organized society around religion in ways that reached far beyond worship. In Puritan New England, the goal was not only religious freedom, but a disciplined community meant to model godly living. That's why town life mattered. Living close together made moral oversight, church-centered life, and enforcement of conformity easier, and those priorities shaped politics and education. Communities committed to reading Scripture invested in literacy. Communities committed to conformity punished dissent. Over time, these practices became part of regional identity. The plantation economy created another enduring structure, especially in the Chesapeake. Tobacco generated major wealth, but required intense labor. At first, much of that labor came from indentured servants bound for years in exchange for passage and freedom dues. But plantation profit pushed toward a workforce that could be controlled more completely and permanently. Over time, colonists built racial slavery, supported by law and by ideas that linked African descent to lifelong bondage. This wasn't incidental. It reshaped wealth, political power, and even the meaning of freedom by embedding a system where liberty for some depended on coercion for others. Expansion also followed a broad pattern of land seizure and labor control, often requiring dehumanization. Native peoples were displaced through warfare, coercive treaties, and the steady pressure of settlement. Africans were forced into labor through the Atlantic slave trade and kept there through law and violence. The long-term result was a continent reorganized around European claims, even as native nations persisted and resisted, and enslaved people survived and fought back, struggles that shaped every colony's development. The environment records these choices too. Colonization transformed ecosystems through forests cleared for farms and shipbuilding, wetlands drained, and European animals and crops altering plant life, soils, and waterways. Small changes compounded over time. If a settlement clears a little more land each year, after decades, the landscape is transformed in a way no single year can explain. The point isn't the math, it's accumulation. Early decisions layered into durable political, social, racial, and environmental structures that later Americans inherited. Key takeaways. Spanish colonization relied on fortified outposts and missions, St. Augustine, Santa Fe, to secure territory and convert indigenous peoples. Dutch and French colonies prioritized trade networks, with New France combining commerce and Jesuit missions, and New Netherland operating as a profit-focused trading hub, later taken by England in 1664. English colonies diverged sharply, New England emphasizing town-based Puritan communities, and the Chesapeake developing plantation agriculture that shifted from indentured servitude toward African slavery, alongside political milestones like the 1619 legislature and conflicts such as Bacon's Rebellion and King Philip's War. A useful way to synthesize the era is to compare colonial models, because each empire left distinct fingerprints on North America. Spain, especially in Florida and the Southwest, paired military control with religious missions. Fortified outposts weren't only defenses, they enforced territorial claims in a world where maps mattered only when power backed them. St. Augustine, founded in 1565, anchored Spanish influence on the Atlantic to protect routes and deter rivals. Santa Fe, founded in 1610, served a similar purpose inland as a strategic base to project authority across long distances. Missions were central to this strategy. Spain aimed to incorporate indigenous peoples into the imperial system through conversion and labor obligations, making missionaries agents of colonization as well as religious leaders. Missions weren't simply churches in the wilderness. They attempted to reshape language, work routines, family structures, and spiritual life. For Native communities, this meant pressure to abandon established practices and accept new hierarchies, often amid coercion and disease. Spanish colonization is best pictured as a network: forts to hold territory, missions to transform communities, and settlements to supply both. The French and Dutch built colonies oriented more directly around trade networks. This approach could still be disruptive, but it relied less on massive settler populations and more on sustaining relationships that kept goods moving. In New France, the fur trade linked Europeans and indigenous nations across the interior. French traders depended on native expertise for travel and alliance-making, and Jesuit missionaries operated within that same world of exchange, so religion and economics often advanced together. New Netherland showed the profit logic most clearly. Centered on New Amsterdam, it functioned as a commercial hub for ships, furs, and finance. Its diversity of languages and religions reflected not only tolerance, but the practical openness of a trading society. If you could trade, you could matter. When England took New Netherland in 1664, it wasn't just a flag change. It showed how colonies served as pieces in European rivalry because they controlled harbors, rivers, and trade routes. English colonies were the most internally varied, with multiple social experiments developing at once. In New England, Puritans organized around towns and congregations. Town life made politics feel local and communal, but membership was conditional on meeting religious and moral expectations, which shaped how authority felt, legitimate when close, familiar, and tied to a moral mission. The Chesapeake, Virginia, and later Maryland developed around plantation agriculture. Staple crop production shaped settlement patterns as plantations spread along rivers that served as transportation corridors, producing dispersed estates instead of compact towns. That economic structure reinforced a political one. Large planters amassed land, labor, and influence, while many settlers became dependent. The 1619 legislature, the Virginia House of Burgesses, emerged in this property-centered world and helped establish the precedent that political voice belonged primarily to landowning settlers. Labor systems reveal this social order forming in real time. Indentured servitude initially supplied much of the workforce, and many servants imagined a path from hardship to land ownership. Some succeeded, but as land grew scarce and inequality deepened, that ladder collapsed for many. Those tensions help explain Bacon's rebellion in 1676. Not random violence, but a clash among frontier settlers demanding land and protection, elites protecting control, and native nations resisting expansion. The uprising exposed how unstable Virginia could become when poorer colonists felt excluded. And one lasting effect was elite distrust of relying on armed, discontented former servants, pushing the colony further toward racial slavery as a tool to secure labor and divide working people. In New England, conflict exposed a different but equally significant dynamic. King Philip's War in the 1670s revealed how quickly expansion could produce catastrophe. As English towns demanded more land, native communities faced existential pressure. The war's brutality shattered hopes for easy coexistence and hardened attitudes. Many English settlers came to view native peoples as permanent enemies, while native communities suffered devastating losses. To understand later U.S. history, removal policies, frontier warfare, contested sovereignty, this is an early moment when those patterns become unmistakable. By the end of the 1600s, distinct regional trajectories were clear. Spanish borderlands combined forts, missions, and distant imperial enforcement. French and Dutch colonies revolved around trade networks and alliances, sometimes flexible, sometimes exploitative. English colonies split between a town-centered, religiously driven New England and a plantation-centered Chesapeake, where representative institutions grew alongside inequality and racial slavery. These were not just different ways to do colonies. They were social blueprints embedded in land ownership, law, labor, and war, and therefore difficult to undo. Bridge to next lesson. The competing colonial models and intensifying rivalries set the stage for a more unified British imperial system and escalating warfare in the 1700s. Next, students will trace how colonial growth, trade regulations, and imperial conflict, culminating in wars like the French and Indian Wars, the 7 Years' War beginning in 1754, pushed colonies toward new political tensions and, eventually, revolution. By 1700, North America wasn't merely a patchwork of European claims. It was a set of competing systems pressing against one another. Where empires met, tension followed because control of river valleys, harbors, and trade routes determined colonial survival. England's takeover of New Netherland didn't end rivalry. It sharpened it by creating a more continuous English Atlantic coastline, while French influence extended down from the St. Lawrence into the interior. Spain still claimed vast territory and guarded key outposts, even as frontier control varied. The basic rhythm heading into the 1700s was growth colliding with other growth. The next shift was imperial coordination. Britain increasingly acted like a centralized empire seeking revenue and control, not scattered settlements under the same flag. As colonial economies and Atlantic trade expanded, Britain had stronger incentives to regulate commerce, enforce navigation rules, and treat colonies as parts of one system. That policy had everyday consequences. Merchants faced constraints, smuggling opportunities expanded, assemblies argued with royal officials, and colonists accustomed to local control felt new pressure from distant authority. Rivalry also turned into war more predictably. As English settlers moved inland and French traders and forts strengthened claims, the interior became a zone where diplomacy and violence intertwined. Native nations were forced to navigate a more dangerous balance of power. By 1754, pressures over land hunger, imperial competition, and the question of continental dominance ignited the French and Indian War, part of the 7 Years' War. Carry forward the through line from this era. The later push toward revolution doesn't appear out of thin air. The political habit of assemblies, the economic habit of plantation profit and Atlantic trade, and the military habit of frontier conflict all formed earlier. Colonies began as experiments in social order, but they became systems with momentum, pulling the 1700s toward bigger government, bigger wars, and sharper arguments about rights and power. And the central contradiction endures. Freedom in early America often grew within structures that denied freedom to others, a tension that became one of the driving forces